With us now from Washington, D.C. is USA Today senior political reporter Heidi Przybyla and Washington Post national political correspondent James Hohmann. James, let me get to you first. How significant is Carly Fiorina's endorsement of Ted Cruz?
I think it's pretty significant because Ted Cruz, frankly, is trying to show that he can coalesce the party to be the conservative alternative to Donald Trump. I spent a lot of time talking to Republicans at different rallies and events, and a surprising number tell me Carly Fiorina was their first choice. A lot of women really respect her and like her. You know, you never want to put too much credence or stock in these endorsements. Marco Rubio has more endorsements than anyone else at this point, and it hasn't mattered. But I think it's a significant endorsement at a significant moment going into the key primaries next Tuesday.
And Heidi, what about the fact that this was held in Florida?
Well, Florida is going to be where this all comes down, I think, because what's happening to Marco Rubio in Florida is that Ted Cruz is basically trying to take him out. Now, I don't think that Ted Cruz actually has a chance of winning Florida, but he could try and come up on Donald Trump pretty significantly in there if, like James says, he is consolidating some more of the conservative wing of the party. But I also don't think that this changes, just to get back to your previous question, I don't think that this changes the fundamentals of the fact that Ted Cruz is not, so far as we can tell, unless this endorsement dramatically changes things, expanding his base. And the opportunities, the big opportunities for Ted Cruz are in the rearview mirror. They were the southern states where Donald Trump routed him. So I think what we're coming down to here is basically a do or die contest on March 15th with these winner-take-all states. And if Donald Trump comes out of there winning Florida and comes close in Ohio, I think we're talking about either Donald Trump or a contested convention.
It is a fascinating point, Heidi. James, I want to go back to Marco Rubio. He didn't win any states last night, and today that we're learning that allies very close to Rubio's campaign are advising the Florida senator to drop out. Now, in public, they say that that's not the case, that they're going to keep going until Florida, but some are saying that he may be considering, or at least people close to him may be considering, dropping out before Florida. What do you make of this?
You know, I think that's a very bad storyline to have out there when you're trying to win Florida. New polls out today show that he's down double digits against Trump in his home state. He said he needs to win Florida, and he's in sort of a catch-22. There are a lot of donors who are standing on the sidelines saying, you know, I like Marco, but I'm concerned about his failure to win any states. I want to see him win Florida before I open my checkbook or before I decide to endorse him. But he needs those supporters in order to win Florida. One of the issues for him is he's 44 years old, so he still has a couple of decades potentially left in his political career. And the calculus for him is if you get really wiped out in your home state and you get humiliated, how much does that hurt your future prospects? But we're in this climate now where it's very clear the Republican grassroots don't want to anoint an establishment candidate, and Marco Rubio has become this year's establishment candidate now that everyone else has dropped out.
Heidi, there was an interesting op-ed in the Washington Post, of all places, and we actually had the writer of that piece, Catherine Rampell, here to talk about something that I thought was really interesting. And the biggest point was that the two that struck out to me, one, that Senator Cruz and Marco Rubio are not that far away policy-wise from where Donald Trump is, and two, the idea that he's not conservative enough is not of consequence to his voters. What do you think about that?
That Donald Trump's not conservative enough, you mean?
The people who support him don't care about ideology as much as, for example, Senator Cruz does.
Well, they care about the ideology that Donald Trump has put front and center. And while the case that you make is true, that when you look at policies like immigration, Marco Rubio has kind of been painted as a flip-flopper on that issue, even though he's now closer to where Trump is. Ted Cruz also has been nailed a little bit on some of his past support that may not have been as purist, whereas Donald Trump is making a very frontal argument. And I think this is also what the media and the establishment completely missed, which was that the seeds of this were planted and out there for everybody to see back in 2014 when you had guys like Scott Brown, moderate Republicans from New Hampshire, running on immigration and really closing the gap with his Democratic counterpart. So I think that it's just a function of the fact that Donald Trump, all candidates who make their arguments very simplistic and very compelling, tend to do better. And Donald Trump has done that from day one, beginning with his announcement speech.
Before we move on to the Democrats, James and Heidi, I want to ask you to me it seems that as if it will be disconcerting if you have the Republican establishment all coming out guns a-blazing to take down Donald Trump, and should he secure the GOP nomination, they fall in line with him. Is that not going to be, when it comes to the GOP base at least, somewhat bizarre?
At this point, it's very, very hard to imagine the Republican Party not being fractured going into the fall. I really don't know what scenario would exist where, if Trump's the nominee, there are all these big people, senators, governors on the record saying they won't support him. And if at this point the Republican establishment stops Trump from becoming the nominee, there's this huge base of energy in the party that I don't think is going to get behind whoever is perceived as stealing the nomination away. So I think Republicans are in a really dangerous, bad place. I think we'll have a lot of clarity in the next week. As Heidi said earlier, if John Kasich loses Ohio and Marco Rubio loses Florida, the nomination contest is basically over. Trump's going to be the Republican nominee.
But Heidi, as noted earlier in this conversation, Cruz hasn't received any endorsements either.
Other than Carly Fiorina today.
Yeah, other
she's
than
an
Carly
outsider.
Fiorina, exactly. So, right now it looks as though it's either Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, and neither of them seem to be well liked within this party.
That's a real problem that somehow just doesn't seem to matter to Donald Trump's base, because we saw just this morning new polling coming out saying that the number of Republicans who actually feel negatively about him is almost hitting 50%. When is the last time you can remember a Republican nominee with 50% of his base having negative feelings about him? So I think this is just something that's going to be much more relevant come the general election, but it goes back to the whole plot line of this entire race on the Republican side, which is that the Republican Party is fundamentally fractured, and they cannot consolidate behind an alternative to Trump, because their alternatives themselves are of very different wings of the party. Look at Ted Cruz; he's an outsider. John Kasich, he's a governor. And considered more moderate. So it's just a function as well of the party itself not able to find a way to come together to be that alternative to Trump.